They said it casually at first, like it was an old joke everyone already knew. A throwaway comment during a panel discussion, whispered between chuckles, typed into comment sections, repeated in classrooms and boardrooms alike. Filipinos don't speak proper English. It was said with confidence, as if history itself had signed off on the claim. For years, the sentence floated through academic circles, online forums, and corporate hiring rooms, rarely challenged, often accepted. It wasn't always meant to wound, but it always did. In a crowded lecture hall at a prestigious international education conference in Singapore, the phrase surfaced again. This time, it came from a well-dressed consultant presenting a slideshow on global English proficiency and workforce readiness. His data charts flashed on the screen, ranking countries by test scores and pronunciation benchmarks. When he reached Southeast Asia, he paused, smiled politely, and said, "Of course, countries like the Philippines struggle with proper English usage despite long exposure." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the audience. Some nodded, others typed notes. No one objected, at least not yet. In the third row sat Professor Jonathan Hale, a senior linguist from Harvard University, known in academic circles for his calm demeanor and surgical precision with words. He had spent over 30 years studying language evolution, colonial linguistics, and global Englishes. His gray hair was neatly combed, his glasses thin and unassuming. He didn't look angry, he looked thoughtful, and when the consultant concluded and invited questions, Professor Hale raised his hand. The room hushed, not because anyone expected a confrontation, but because the Harvard name carried weight. The moderator nodded to him. "I appreciate your presentation," Hale began evenly. "But I'd like to challenge a foundational assumption you just made." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "What do you mean by proper English?" The consultant blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. "Standard English," he replied. "Clear pronunciation, grammatical accuracy, professional fluency." Hale nodded. "And whose standard would that be?" The consultant laughed lightly. "Well, internationally recognized norms. British or American English." A few audience members nodded again. It sounded reasonable enough. Professor Hale leaned forward slightly. "So let me ask you this," he said. "If English evolved differently in the United States than in Britain, would early British scholars have been correct to say Americans didn't speak proper English?" A murmur rippled through the hall. The consultant hesitated. "That's not exactly the same." "It's precisely the same," Hale replied calmly. "Language evolves through context, culture, and usage. English in the Philippines has a distinct history, one that includes formal education, literature, governance, and media. To dismiss it as improper is not linguistic analysis. It's prejudice disguised as standardization." The room shifted. Pens stopped moving. Phones lowered. Hale wasn't finished. He began telling a story, not from textbooks, but from his own experience. Years earlier, he had been a visiting professor in Manila, invited to collaborate with local universities on comparative linguistics. Before arriving, colleagues had warned him to simplify his language and prepare for misunderstandings. He ignored them. On his first day, he delivered a lecture on semantic shift and postcolonial English. Within minutes, students were engaging him with questions sharper and more nuanced than he had encountered in many Ivy League classrooms. "They didn't just understand English," Hale said, his voice steady. "They challenged it. They bent it. They understood its mechanics deeply enough to question its assumptions." He described a student named Maria, who had written a paper analyzing political rhetoric using Philippine English idioms alongside American discourse models. Her writing was precise, elegant, and intellectually fearless. Another student, Daniel, debated him for 20 minutes on syntactic variation, citing sources from British, American, and Filipino scholars without missing a beat. "I've taught at Harvard for decades," Hale said. "Fluency does not belong to a passport." The consultant shifted uncomfortably. The moderator glanced at the clock but didn't interrupt. Hale continued, now addressing the room rather than the presenter. He spoke of history, how English was institutionalized in the Philippines through education systems, legal frameworks, and literature. How generations of Filipinos grew up reading Shakespeare, Faulkner, and Rizal in English. How newspapers, courtrooms, and universities functioned in the language long before many other nations adopted it formally. And yet, Hale said softly, they are told they don't speak it properly because their accent doesn't sound like yours. The word accent hung in the air. He explained that accent is not a marker of intelligence or proficiency, but of identity. That every English speaker, including those in London or New York, speaks with an accent shaped by geography and culture. To elevate one accent as proper as to erase the legitimacy of all others. Somewhere in the back, a Filipino educator wiped her eyes. The conversation might have ended there, but what followed transformed it into something larger. During the break, several attendees approached Hale, some curious, some defensive. A British recruiter asked if he truly believed Filipino English belonged in global corporate settings. Absolutely, Hale replied. In fact, many multinational companies already rely on Filipino professionals for global communication precisely because of their clarity, adaptability, and cultural sensitivity. A young African linguistics student asked him how to fight similar stereotypes about her own country's English. You speak, Hale said simply. And you don't apologize for how history shaped your voice. Word of the exchange spread quickly. A short clip from the session appeared online, recorded on a phone from the second row. Hale's question, "Who's standard?" became the headline. Within days, the video had millions of views. Comment sections erupted, some defensive, others grateful. Filipinos from around the world shared stories of being corrected, mocked, or dismissed despite their fluency. Teachers posted screenshots of essays their students had been told were too informal, despite perfect grammar. Call center workers described being trained to suppress their natural accent to sound more American. And then came the responses from academics. Linguists from universities across continents weighed in, supporting Hale's position. Articles appeared explaining World Englishes, a well-established field recognizing multiple legitimate forms of English shaped by local contexts. Philippine English, they wrote, was not broken English. It was a recognized variety with its own norms, dictionaries, and literary tradition. Harvard itself released a brief statement quoting Hale's remarks and affirming the importance of linguistic diversity. It wasn't flashy, but it was firm. For many Filipinos, the moment felt like validation long overdue. Not because they needed permission to be fluent, but because someone with global authority had finally said aloud what they had always known. In Quezon City, Maria, now a graduate student, watched the clip on her phone between classes. She smiled quietly. She remembered that lecture years ago. Remembered how Professor Hale had listened to her argument without condescension, how he had treated her English not as a borrowed tool but as a rightful voice. In Chicago, a Filipino-American teenager replayed the video before a school presentation. When a classmate mocked his pronunciation, he stood taller and said, "There isn't one proper English." His teacher nodded. Even the consultant from the conference eventually issued a clarification, acknowledging the complexity of global English and the limitations of standardized metrics. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. Professor Hale returned to his work, declining most interview requests. When pressed by a journalist about why he spoke up, he shrugged. Because silence would have been easier, he said. And because language deserves truth. The story continued to ripple outward, not as a viral outrage cycle, but as a slow correction. Universities revised training materials. Recruiters reconsidered accent bias. Students felt a little less pressure to erase themselves. They had said Filipinos didn't speak proper English. What they learned instead was that English does not belong to one nation, one sound, or one history. It belongs to those who use it to think, to argue, to imagine, and to speak their truth. And when a Harvard professor finally spoke up, the world was reminded that fluency is not about sounding right. It's about being understood, and understanding others in return.